Mesopotamia Part I. The Kingdoms of Chaldea and Assyria. Historical Note. The history of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley begins with the Chaldaeans of perhaps 6,000 years ago. They were an intelligent people. They were skilled in astronomy, they knew how to write, and they collected large libraries of tablets of clay upon which inscriptions had been imprinted in cuneiform, or wedge-shaped characters. They built lofty temples, rising terrace above terrace of sun-dried bricks, which crumbled in time and fell into shapeless masses. About 1300 B.C. the Assyrians overcame the Chaldaeans. The Assyrians were a proud, cruel people, and their kings delighted in recording the savageness with which they had treated their captives. They too were famous builders, but unfortunately they had no better material than the sun-dried brick. They were as interested as the Chaldaeans in making collections of books or tablets, and the royal library at Nineveh is thought to have contained 10,000 volumes, many of which were copies of the old Chaldean writings. The best-known names among the Assyrian rulers are Sennacherib, who destroyed Babylon and besieged Jerusalem, and Ashurbanipal, whom the Greeks called Sardanapalus. The reign of the latter was marked by magnificence in his court and success in his military operations. This was the golden age of literature and a time of great prosperity. End of section 85. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Gould. The northern part of Mesopotamia, or the country lying between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, was ancient Assyria. The southern part was Chaldea or Babylonia. The supreme power in the valley was first held by the Chaldeans, then by the Assyrians, then by the Babylonians. The Editor. Here it will not be amiss to say something of the Chaldeans, as the Babylonians call them, and of their antiquity, that nothing worth remark may be omitted. They, being the most ancient Babylonians, hold the same station and dignity in the commonwealth as the Egyptian priests do in Egypt. For being deputed to divine offices, they spend all their time in the study of philosophy, and are especially famous for the art of astrology. They are mightily given to divination, and foretell future events, and employ themselves either by purification, sacrifices, or other enchantments to avert evils, or procure good fortune and success. They are skilful likewise in the art of divination by the flying of birds, and interpreting of dreams and prodigies, and are reputed as true oracles, in declaring what will come to pass, by their exact and diligent viewing the entrails of the sacrifices. But they attain not to this knowledge in the same manner as the Grecians do, for the Chaldeans learn it by tradition from their ancestors, the son from the father, who are all in the meantime free from all other public offices and attendances, and because their parents are their tutors, they both learn everything without envy, and rely with more confidence upon the truth of what is taught them. And being trained up in this learning from their very childhood, they become most famous philosophers, that age being most capable of learning wherein they spend much of their time. They hold that the world is eternal, which had neither any certain beginning nor shall have any end, but all agree that all things are ordered, and this beautiful fabric is supported by a divine providence, and that the motions of the heavens are not performed by chance and of their own accord, but by a certain and determinate will and appointment of the gods. Therefore, from a long observation of the stars, and an exact knowledge of the motions and influences of every one of them, wherein they excel all others, they foretell many things that are to come to pass. They say that the 5 stars which some call planets, but which they call interpreters, are most worthy of consideration, both for their motions and their remarkable influences, especially that which the Grecians call Saturn. The brightest of them all, and which often portends many and great events, they call Sol. The other 4 they name Mars, Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter, with our own country astrologers. They give the name of interpreters to these stars, because these only by a peculiar motion portend things to come. and instead of interpreters do declare to men beforehand the goodwill of the gods; whereas the other stars, not being of the number of the planets, have a constant ordinary motion. Future events, they say, are pointed at sometimes by their rising, and sometimes by their setting, and at other times by their colour, as may be experienced by those that will diligently observe it; sometimes foreshowing hurricanes, at other times tempestuous rains, and then again exceeding droughts. By these, they say, are often portended the appearance of comets, eclipses of the sun and moon, earthquakes, and all the other various changes and remarkable effects in the air, boding good and bad not only to nations in general, but to kings and private persons in particular. Under the course of these planets, they say, are 30 stars, which they call counselling gods, half of whom observe what is done under the earth, and what is transacted in the heavens. Once every 10 days' space, they say, one of the highest order of these stars descends to them that are of the lowest, like a messenger sent from them above, and then again another ascends from those below to them above, and that this is their constant natural motion to continue forever. The chief of these gods, they say, are 12 in number, to each of which they attribute a month and one sign of the 12 in the zodiac. Through these 12 signs the sun, moon, and the other 5 planets run their course, the sun in a year's time, and the moon in the space of a month. To every one of the planets they assign their own proper courses, where are performed variously in lesser or shorter time, according as their several motions are quicker or slower. These stars, they say, have a great influence both as to good and bad in men's nativities, and from the consideration of their several natures may be foreknown what will befall men afterwards. As they foretold things to come to other kings formerly, so they did to Alexander, who conquered Darius, and to his successors Antigonus and Seleucus Nicanor, and accordingly things fell out as they declared. They tell likewise private men their fortunes so certainly, that those who have found the thing true by experience have esteemed it a miracle and above the reach of man to perform. Out of the circle of the zodiac they describe 24 stars, 12 toward the North Pole and as many toward the South. Those which we see they assign to the living, and the others that do not appear they conceive are constellations for the dead, and they term them judges of all things. The moon, they say, is in the lowest orb, and being therefore next to the earth, because she is so small, she finishes her course in a little time, not through the swiftness of her motion, but the shortness of her sphere. In that which they affirm, that she has but a borrowed light, and that when she is eclipsed it is caused by the interposition of the shadow of the earth, they agree with the Grecians. Their rules and notions concerning the eclipses of the sun are but weak and mean, which they dare not positively foretell nor fix a certain time for them. They have likewise opinions concerning the earth peculiar to themselves, affirming it to resemble a boat and to be hollow; to prove which, and other things relating to the frame of the world, they abound in arguments, but to give a particular account of them we conceive would be a thing foreign to our history. But this any man may justly and truly say, that the Chaldaeans far exceed all other men in the knowledge of astrology, and have studied it most of any art or science. But the number of years during which the Chaldaeans say those of their profession have given themselves to the study of this natural philosophy is incredible. For when Alexander was in Asia they reckoned up 470,000 years since they first began to observe the motions of the stars. But lest we should make too long a digression from our intended design, let this which we have said concerning the Chaldaeans suffice. End of section 86. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Gould.
Section 87. How the Chaldaeans Wrote Books, by G. Maspero. The position of a scribe was an important one. We continually meet with it in all grades of society, in the palaces, in the temples, in the storehouses, in private dwellings. In fine, the scribe was ubiquitous. At court, in the town, in the country, in the army, managing affairs both small and great, and seeing that they were carried on regularly. His education differed but little from that given to the Egyptian scribe. He learned the routine of administration of judicial affairs, the formularies for correspondence either with nobles or with ordinary people, the art of writing, of calculating quickly, and of making out bills correctly. We may well ask whether he ever employed papyrus or prepared skins for these purposes. It would indeed seem strange that after centuries of intercourse no caravan should have brought into Chaldea any of those materials which were in such constant use for literary purposes in Africa. Yet the same clay which furnished the architect with such an abundant building material appears to have been the only medium for transmitting the language which the scribes possessed. They were always provided with slabs of a fine plastic clay, carefully mixed and kept sufficiently moist to take easily the impression of an object, but at the same time sufficiently firm to prevent the marks once made from becoming either blurred or effaced. When a scribe had a text to copy or a document to draw up, he chose out one of his slabs, which he placed flat upon his left palm, and taking in the right hand a triangular stylus of flint, copper, bronze, or bone, he at once set to work. The instrument in early times terminated in a fine point, and the marks made by it, when it was gently pressed upon the clay, were slender and of uniform thickness. In later times the extremity of the stylus was cut with a bevel, and the impression then took the shape of a metal nail or a wedge. They wrote from left to right along the upper part of the tablet, and covered both sides of it with closely written lines, which sometimes ran over on to the edges. When the writing was finished, the scribe sent his work to the potter, who put it in the kiln and baked it. Or the writer may have had a small oven at his own disposition, as a clerk with us would have his table or desk. The shape of these documents varied, and sometimes strikes us as being peculiar. Besides the tablets and the bricks, we find small solid cones or hollow cylinders of considerable size, on which the kings related their exploits, or recorded the history of their wars or the dedication of their buildings. This method had a few inconveniences, but many advantages. These clay books were heavy to hold and clumsy to handle, while the characters did not stand out well from the brown, yellow, and whitish background of the material, but on the other hand a poem, baked and incorporated into the page itself, ran less danger of destruction than if scribbled in ink on sheets of papyrus. Fire could make no impression on it. It could withstand water for a considerable length of time. Even if broken, the pieces were still of use. As long as it was not pulverized, the entire document could be restored, with the exception, perhaps, of a few signs or some scraps of a sentence. The inscriptions which have been saved from the foundations of the most ancient temples, several of which date back 40 or 50 centuries, are for the most part as clear and legible as when they left the hands of the writer who engraved them or of the workman who baked them. It is owing to the material to which they were committed that we possess the principal works of Chaldean literature which have come down to us. Poems, annals, hymns, magical incantations, how few fragments of these would ever have reached us had their authors confided them to parchment or paper after the manner of the Egyptian scribes. The greatest danger that they ran was that of being left forgotten in the corner of the chamber in which they had been kept, or buried under the rubbish of a building after a fire or some violent catastrophe. Even then the debris was the means of preserving them, by falling over them and covering them up. Protected under the ruins, they would lie there for centuries, till the fortunate explorer should bring them to light and deliver them over to the patient study of the learned. The cuneiform character in itself is neither picturesque nor decorative. It does not offer that delightful assemblage of birds and snakes, of men and quadrupeds, of heads and limbs, of tools, weapons, stars, trees, and boats, which succeed each other in perplexing order on the Egyptian monuments, to give permanence to the glory of Pharaoh and the greatness of his gods. Cuneiform writing is essentially composed of thin, short lines, placed in juxtaposition or crossing each other in a somewhat clumsy fashion. It has the appearance of numbers of nails scattered about at haphazard, and its angular configuration and its stiff and spiny appearance give the inscriptions a dull and forbidding aspect which no artifice of the engraver can overcome. Yet, in spite of their seemingly arbitrary character, this mass of strokes had its source in actual hieroglyphics. As in the origin of the Egyptian script, the earliest writers had begun by drawing on stone or clay the outline of the object which they desired to convey the idea. But whereas in Egypt the artistic temperament of the race and the increasing skill of their sculptors had by degrees brought the drawing of each sign to such perfection that it became a miniature portrait of the being or object to be reproduced, in Chaldea, on the contrary, the signs became degraded from their original forms on account of the difficulty experienced in copying them with the stylus on the clay tablets. They lost their original vertical position and were placed horizontally, retaining finally but the very faintest resemblance to the original model. For instance, the Chaldean conception of the sky was that of a vault divided into 8 segments by diameters running from the 4 cardinal points and from their principal subdivisions. The external circle was soon omitted, the transverse lines alone remaining, which again was simplified into a kind of irregular cross. In later times lists were made, in which the scribes strove to place beside each character the special hieroglyph from which it had been derived. Several fragments of these still exist, a study of which seems to show that the Assyrian scribes of a more recent period were at times as much puzzled as we are ourselves to get at the principles of their own script. End of section 87. This recording is in the public domain.
First half of the 16th century. The Editor. Their great fortress then did they found, and cast till they got sure ground. All fell to work, both man and child. Some howked clay, some burnt the tiled. Nimrod, that curious champion, deviser was of that dungeon. Nothing they spared their labours, like busy bees upon the flowers, or emmets travelling into June, some underwrought and some aboon, with strang ingenious masonry, upward their work did fortify. The land about was fair and plain, and it rose like one high mountain. Those foolish people did intend that till the heaven it should ascend. So great one strength was never seen into the world with men's een. The walls of that work they made 52 fathom bread. 1 fathom then, as some men says, might ben 2 fathom in our days. 1 man was then of more stature, nor 2 be now, of this be sure. The translator of Orosius into his chronicle writes thus, that when the sun is at the height, at noon when it doth shine most bright, the shadow of that hideous strength 6 mile and more it is of length. Thus may ye judge into your thought, if Babylon be high or not. Then the great God omnipotent, to whom all things been present, he seeing the ambition and the prideful presumption, how their proud people did pretend up through the heavens till ascend. Sick languages on them he laid, that none wist what one other said. Where was but one language afore, God send them languages 60. Afore that time all spake Hebrew. Then some began for to speak Grew, some Dutch, some language Saracen, and some began to speak Latin. The maester men gan to go wild, crying for trees, they brought them tiled. Some said, Bring mortar here at once. Then brought they to them stocks and stones. And Nimrod, their great champion, ran ragged like one wild lion, menacing them with words rude, but never one word they understood. End of section 88. This recording is in the public domain.
present their subjects in profile. They had not the skill to indicate or suggest. Each part must be brought forward and shown as nearly in full as possible. In the lion hunt, for instance, the moment is chosen when each of the 4 legs of the wounded lion are in view. It went beyond Assyrian skill to arrange the 12 legs of 3 horses in such wise as to not make them appear a mere wilderness, so here we are supposed to understand that the left legs of each animal are exactly behind the right legs, which are shown in the relief. Everything is clear and distinct. We know just how a driver held the reins, how an archer drew his bow, how many spokes were in the wheels, how his whip was made. Indeed, we can almost count the arrows in the 2 quivers. This is the fascination of Assyrian sculpture, that, little of art in the modern sense as it manifests, it does have the power to tell a story and to show how things were done. It reveals how the soldiers made their camp, crossed rivers, attacked cities, and tortured their enemies, how the king appeared sitting on his throne, or offering up a sacrifice, or eating his dinner with the queen in the palace gardens. In short, to study an Assyrian bas-relief is like taking a long look into the life that once dwelt between the Tigris and the Euphrates. End of section 89. This recording is in the public domain.
By A. H. Sayce. Babylonia was the land of bricks, Assyria of stone. It was in Babylonia that the great tower had been built of brick, whose head it was intended should reach to heaven. The bricks were merely dried in the sun. It was but rarely that they were baked in the kiln. When it was wished to give additional solidity to the walls of a building, lighted fuel was piled up against them, and their surfaces were thus vitrified into a solid mass. But usually the Babylonian builders were content with the ordinary sun-dried brick of the country. Naturally, it crumbled away in the course of time, and the brick structure became a mound of shapeless mud. Nebuchadnezzar tells us how the great temple of the 7 planets of heaven and earth at Borsippa, near Babylon, whose ruins are now known under the name of the Bursi at Nimrud, and which has often been identified with the Tower of Babel, had been destroyed before his time by rain and storm, and neglect to repair its drains. In fact, the plain of Babylonia was covered with artificial hills, formed of the debris of ancient temples which had been allowed to fall into decay. One of the earliest names given to it on the monuments is that of the land of mounds. No stone was found in the country. If stone was used, as for instance by Nebuchadnezzar in his construction of the keys of Babylon, it had to be brought from the distant mountains of Elam. Even the smallest stones and pebbles were highly prized. Hence it was that in Babylonia the art of engraving seems to have taken its rise. We learn from Herodotus that every Babylonian carried about with him an engraved seal attached to his wrist by a cord, and the statement is fully confirmed by the native monuments. The seal was of cylindrical shape, pierced longitudinally by a hole through which the cord was passed. When it was needed to be used, it was rolled over the wet clay which served the Babylonians as a writing material, and it was regarded as the necessary guarantee of the owner's identity. No legal deed or contract was valid without the impression of the seals belonging to the persons who took part in it. The engraved stone, in fact, was as indispensable to its owner as his name itself. In Assyria, on the contrary, clay was comparatively scarce, and stone was plentiful. Hence, while the temples and palaces of Babylonia were built of brick, those of Assyria were, at all events in part, built in stone. The Assyrians, however, had originally migrated from Babylonia, and they carried with them the tradition of the art and architecture of their mother country. Accordingly, while making use of stone, they nevertheless did not altogether forego the use of brick. The walls of Nineveh, in spite of their height, were constructed of brick, and it was only the basement of the palaces which was made of stone. We need not be surprised at this slavish imitation of a style of building which was out of place in the country to which it was transferred. In another respect, the Assyrians imitated the architecture of Babylonia even more slavishly and needlessly. This was in the construction of vast platforms of brick upon which the temples of the gods and the palaces of the kings were erected. In Babylonia such platforms were necessary in order to secure the edifices upon them from the danger of floods, or the inconveniences of a marshy soil. But in Assyria similar precautions were not required. There the buildings could have been raised on a foundation of rock without the intervention of an artificial platform. The brick walls of the Babylonian houses were covered with stucco, which was then adorned with painting. Dados ran around them, whereupon were depicted the figures of men and animals. In the Assyrian palaces the dado was formed of sculptured slabs of stone, and painted in imitation of the dados of painted stucco which were usual in Babylonia. The cornices and other portions of the walls were, in the houses of the wealthy, often ornamented with bronze and alabaster and even gold. At times ivory was used for the same purpose as in the ivory palaces of Samaria. The doors more especially were overlaid with bands of bronze, and were frequently double, the hinges revolving in sockets of bronze. The windows were protected from the weather by means of curtains of tapestry, and a flight of steps open to the air led to the upper stories of the house. The steps opened upon a court around which the sitting rooms and bedchambers were built, the apartments assigned to the women being kept separate from those of the men. All these luxuries, however, were confined to the rich and noble. The mass of the people lived, like their descendants today, in mud cabins, with conical roofs of clay. They had to be content to live on the ground floor, and to exclude the cold and rains of winter, not with costly tapestries, but by making the apertures in the walls which served as windows as small as possible. It is needless to say that the bronze and sculpture and painting which adorned the habitations of the wealthy were unknown in those of the poor. Even in the houses of the wealthy the furniture was doubtless as scanty and simple as it is still today in the East. Rugs of variegated patterns were laid upon the floor, and chairs and stools of various shapes and sizes were used. The stools were generally lofty, so that the feet of the sitter had to be supported on a footstool. Some of the chairs were provided with arms. At times, instead of chairs, couches or divans were employed. The luxurious Assyrian would even recline on a couch when eating, a habit which passed from the East to Greece, and from Greece to Rome, so that in the days of our Saviour it was more customary to recline than to sit at meat. One of the bas-reliefs in the British Museum represents the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal lying on a couch while he drinks wine and feasts after the defeat and death of his Elamite enemy, though his wife, who participates in the banquet, is seated on a chair. The custom of reclining at meals was doubtless borrowed by the Assyrians from Babylonia, since the older native fashion was to seat the guests at a dinner party on lofty stools on either side of a small table. At night the wealthier classes slept on bedsteads covered with thick mattresses or rugs. Poorer people were satisfied with the mattress only, which was spread upon the ground and rolled up when no longer needed for use. It was a bed which could be taken up and carried away, like the beds we read of in the New Testament. All classes alike slept in their ordinary clothes. The house of the well-to-do Assyrian or Babylonian was not considered complete unless it was provided with a garden or plantation, which it would seem was usually planted in front of it. It was well stocked with trees, among which the palm naturally held a chief place. In warm weather tables and seats were placed under the shade of the trees, and meals were thus taken in the open air. Those who could afford to keep slaves for the purpose employed one of them in waving a large fan, in order to drive insects away while the meal was being enjoyed. In taking the lease of a house, the tenant usually agreed to keep the garden in order, and to replace any trees that might die or be cut down. The garden was irrigated from one of the numerous canals which intersected the whole of Babylonia. The rich employed hired laborers for the purpose, the poor had to irrigate their own plot of ground. The water was drawn up in buckets and then poured into a number of rivulets which ran through the garden. Vegetables of all kinds were grown along the edges of the rivulets, more especially onions and garlic. It would appear that flowers also were cultivated, at all events in the gardens of the wealthy, since vases of flowers were placed on the tables at a banquet. The costume of the people was as varied as it is in the modern European world. Old lists of clothing have come down to us which contain as large an assortment of different dresses and their materials as could be found in a shop of today. Among the materials may be mentioned the Sindhu, or muslin of India, which is described as being composed of vegetable wool or cotton, and so bears testimony to an ancient trade between Chaldea and the western coast of India. Most of the stuffs, however, were of home manufacture, and were exported into all parts of the civilized world. It will be remembered that among the Canaanitish spoil found in the tent of Achan was a goodly Babylonish garment. In spite of the changes of fashion and the varieties of dress worn by different classes of persons, the principal constituents of the Assyrian and Babylonian costume remained the same. These were a hat or head dress, a tunic or shirt, and a long outer robe which reached to the ankles. In early Babylonian times the hat was ornamented with ribbons which projected before and behind like horns. At a later period it assumed the shape of a tiara or peaked helmet. The material of which it was composed was thick and sometimes quilted. The upper classes further protected their heads from the sun by a parasol, which in Assyria became the symbol of royal or semi-royal authority. The tunic was of linen, or wool, the latter material being much employed, particularly in cold weather. It reached halfway down the thigh, and was fastened round the waist by a girdle. A second tunic was often worn under the first, doubtless during the winter season. The long robe or cloak was especially characteristic of the Babylonians. It opened in front, was usually sleeveless, and was ornamented at the edge with fringes. In walking it allowed the inner side of the left leg to be exposed. Not unfrequently the girdle was fastened round it instead of round the tunic. In Assyria the king sometimes wore over his robe a sort of chasuble, richly ornamented like the robe itself. The Babylonian priest was characterized by a curious kind of flounced dress which descended to the feet, and perhaps was made of muslin. From immemorial times a goat skin was also flung over his shoulders, the goat being accounted an animal of peculiar sanctity. On Babylonian cylinders and seals a priest may always be at once distinguished by the flounces of his dress. The costume of the women differed externally but little from that of the men, at least when the latter were dressed in their outer robe. The queen of Ashurbanipal is depicted in a long unsleeved robe over which comes a fringed frock reaching below the knees, and over that again a light cape, also fringed and patterned with rosettes. On her feet are boots, and around her head is a crown or fillet representing a castellated wall, thus resembling the mural crown of Greek sculpture. Earrings, bracelets, and a necklace complete her costume. Earrings, bracelets, and necklaces were also worn by the men. Anklets are referred to in the inscriptions as well as finger rings, though the usual substitute for a finger ring was the cylinder, which, as has already been stated, was attached by a string or chain to the wrist. The Babylonian, at any rate in earlier times, seems ordinarily to have gone barefooted. Already in the 12th century B.C., however, we find the king wearing a pair of soft leather shoes, and in Assyria sandals were in use from an early period, the sandal being furnished with a cap for protecting the heel. Footnote: Merodach Nadinaki, B.C. 1106. He has on his head a tall square cap ornamented in front with a band of rosettes immediately above the forehead, while a row of feathers in an upright position runs round the top. It is curious that a similar headdress was worn by the Zakur, who are usually identified with the Teucrians, and are among the foreign enemies depicted upon the Egyptian monuments. The northern conquests of Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon introduced the laced boot of the inhabitants of the colder regions in the north. The cavalry, who had hitherto ridden with bare legs, now adopted high boots laced in front, and worn over tightly fitting breeches of plaited leather. Certain of the foot soldiers were also clothed in the same way, while others of them wore boots without the trousers. Sennacherib was the first of the Assyrian kings who discarded the sandal in his own person, and substituted for it a shoe, which, like the military boot, was laced in front. It must not be imagined that the robe or even the tunic was always worn. In fact, the light-armed troops in the Assyrian army were contented with a simple kilt, which, together with a felt skull-cap, constituted the whole of their dress. This was also the costume of the Babylonian laborer when working in the fields, and both Assyrians and Babylonians, while engaged in manual work or military operations, discarded the long and inconvenient outer robe. It was only the upper classes who could afford the luxury of wearing it in everyday life. So, too, the use of a hat or cap was not universal. Numbers of people were satisfied with tying up their hair with a fillet or string, even when exposed to the heat of the sun. At times even the fillet was dispensed with. The hair of the head was worn long, and the Assyrians distinguished themselves from their neighbors by dressing and curling both it and their beards. The fashion must have been derived from the early Semitic population of Babylonia, since the hero of the great Chaldaean epic is represented on ancient engraved seals with a curled beard. On the other hand, the practice was unknown to the non-Semitic population of the country. The sculptured heads, for instance, found at Teloth, which belong to the Akkado-Sumerian epic, are either beardless or else provided with long uncurled beards which terminate in a point, the musked and curled Assyrian bull spoken of by Lord Tennyson being a Semitic creation. Here as elsewhere, fashion was determined by physical characteristics, and it was only among a Semitic people distinguished by its thick growth of black hair that the art of the hairdresser could develop as it did in Semitic Babylonia and Assyria. The comparatively beardless Sumerians rather encouraged the barber, who accordingly occupies a conspicuous place in early Babylonian literature. End of section 90. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Philip Gould.
On an expedition against the king of Judah, he laid siege to Jerusalem. The Egyptian forces drew near, coming to the aid of the Jews. Then Sennacherib and his men turned away from the city and went forth to meet the Egyptians. The following account of the result is taken from the 19th chapter of 2 Kings. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed, and went and returned, and dwelt at Nineveh. The Editor. The Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. Like the leaves of the forest when summer is green, that host with their banners at sunset were seen. Like the leaves of the forest when autumn hath blown, that host on the morrow lay withered and strown. For the angel of death spread his wings on the blast, and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed. And the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts but once heaved, and forever grew still. And there lay the steed with his nostril all wide, but through it there rolled not the breath of his pride, and the foam of his gasping lay white on the turf, and cold as the spray of the rock-beating surf. And there lay the rider distorted and pale, with the dew on his brow and the rust on his mail. And the tents were all silent, the banners alone, the lances unlifted, the trumpet unblown. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal. And the might of the Gentile, unsmote by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. End of section 91. This recording is in the public domain.
And in the time of his successor, Saracus, Nineveh was overthrown. and the kingdom of Babylon rose into supreme power. Nebuchadnezzar, the second king of this new monarchy, captured and destroyed Jerusalem. He was so successful in his warfare that he could command the labor of thousands of captives, and so carry on the enormous amount of building with which his name is associated. He built and rebuilt temples and palaces and cities. He raised the wonderful hanging gardens, and he dug a complicated network of canals which carried water into every corner of his land. Babylonia was a mighty kingdom, but lying to the eastward was the land of the Medes and Persians. They too were powerful, and their power was rapidly increasing. King Croesus of Lydia and the joint kings of Babylon, Nabonius, and his son Belshazzar, formed a league against them. But the Persian king Cyrus was more than equal to their combined strength, and Babylon fell into his hands. He spared the city, but his successors were not so forbearing, and in later years it was destroyed, and the vast amount of treasure in the temples was carried away. Alexander the Great planned to rebuild the city, but his early death prevented this, and now hardly a vestige of even its mighty walls can be traced. End of section 92. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.J. Burns.
How Semiramis built Babylon by Diodorus the Sicilian. The king of Assyria, being attacked by hordes from the north and the east, entrusted the southern part of his kingdom to his viceroy, Nabopolassar. The viceroy proved to be a traitor. He held the lands for himself, and with the help of the Medes and his son Nebuchadnezzar, he captured Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian kingdom, which Sennacherib boasted he had made a city shining like the sun. This was the beginning of the Babylonian monarchy. According to Greek tradition, its capital, Babylon, was founded by Queen Semiramis, daughter of a goddess and wife of King Ninus. The Editor. Semiramis was naturally of a high, aspiring spirit, ambitious to excel all her predecessors in glorious actions, and therefore employed all her thoughts about the building of a city in the province of Babylon. And to this end, having provided architects, artists, and all other necessaries for the work, she got together 2 millions of men out of all parts of the empire to be employed in the building of the city. It was so built that the river Euphrates ran through the middle of it, and she compassed it round with a wall of 3 turrets, and such was the state and grandeur of the work that the walls were of that breadth as that 6 chariots might be driven together upon them. Their height was such as exceeded all men's belief that heard of it. But Clitarchus and those who afterwards went over with Alexander into Asia have written that the walls were in circuit 365 furlongs, the queen making them of that compass, to the end that the furlongs should be as many in number as the days of the year. Footnote. A furlong is 1/8 of a mile, an orgius is about 6 feet, a cubit is about 18 inches. End of footnote. They were of brick cemented with brimstone, in height, as Ctesias said, 50 orgius, but as some of the later writers report, but 50 cubits only, and that the breadth was but a little more than what would allow 2 chariots to be driven in front. There were 250 turrets, in height and thickness proportionable to the largeness of the wall. It is not to be wondered at that there were so few towers upon a wall of so great circuit, being that in many places round the city there were deep morasses, so that it was judged to no purpose to raise turrets there, where they were so naturally fortified. Between the wall and the houses there was a space left around the city of 200 feet. That the work might be the more speedily dispatched, to each of her friends was allotted a furlong, with an allowance of all expenses necessary for their several parts, and commanded that all should be finished in a year's time, which being diligently perfected with the queen's approbation, she then made a bridge over the narrowest part of the river, 5 furlongs in length, laying the supports and pillars of the arches with great art and skill at the bottom of the water, 12 feet distant from each other. That the stones might be the more firmly joined, they were bound together with hooks of iron, and the joints filled up with melted lead. And before the pillars she made and placed defences, with sharp pointed angles, to receive the water before it beat upon the flat sides of the pillars, which caused the course of the water to run round by degrees gently and moderately, as far as to the broad sides of the pillars, so that the sharp points of the angles cut the stream, and gave a check to its violence, and the roundness of them, by little and little giving way, abated the force of the current. This bridge was floored with great joists and planks of cedar, cypress, and palm trees, and was 30 feet in breadth, and for art and curiosity yielded to none of the works of Semiramis. On either side of the river she raised a bank, as broad as the wall, and with great cost drew it out in length 100 furlongs. She built likewise 2 palaces at each end of the bridge upon the bank of the river, whence she might have a prospect over the whole city, and make her passage as by quays to the most convenient places in it as she had occasion. And whereas the Euphrates runs through the middle of Babylon, making its course to the south, the palaces lie the one on the east and the other on the west side of the river, both built at exceeding costs and expense. For that on the west had a high and stately wall, made of well-burnt bricks, 60 furlongs in compass. Within this was drawn another of a round circumference, upon which were portrayed in the bricks before they were burned all sorts of living creatures, as if it were to the life, laid with great art in curious colours. This wall was in circuit 40 furlongs, 300 bricks thick, and in height 100 yards, upon which were turrets 140 yards high. The third and most inward wall immediately surrounded the palace, 30 furlongs in compass, and far surmounted the middle wall both in height and thickness, and on this wall and the towers were represented the shapes of all sorts of living creatures, artificially expressed in most lively colours. Especially was represented the general hunting of all sorts of wild beasts, each 4 cubits high and upwards. Amongst these was to be seen Semiramis on horseback, striking a leopard through with a dart, and next to her husband Ninus in close fight with the lion, piercing him with his lance. To this palace she built likewise 3 gates, under which were apartments of brass for entertainments, into which passages were opened by a certain engine. This palace far excelled that on the other side of the river, both in greatness and adornments. For the outermost wall of that, made of well-burnt brick, was but 30 furlongs in compass. Instead of the curious portraiture of beasts, there were the brazen statues of Ninus and Semiramis, the great officers, and of Jupiter, whom the Babylonians call Belus, and likewise armies drawn up in battalia, and divers sorts of hunting were there represented, to the great diversion and pleasure of the beholders. After all these, in a low ground in Babylon, she sank a place for a pond, 4 square, every square being 300 furlongs in length, lined with brick and cemented with brimstone, and the whole 35 feet in depth. Into this, having first turned the river, she then made a passage in form of a vault, from one palace to another, whose arches were built of firm and strong brick, and plastered all over on both sides with bitumen, 4 cubits thick. The walls of this vault were 20 bricks in thickness, and 12 feet high, beside and above the arches, and the breadth was 15 feet. This piece of work being finished in 260 days, The river was turned into its ancient channel again, so that the river flowing over the whole work, Semiramis could go from one palace to the other without passing over the river. She made likewise 2 brazen gates at either end of the vault, which continued to the time of the Persian Empire. In the middle of the city she built a temple to Jupiter, whom the Babylonians call Belus, as we have before said, of which, since writers differ among themselves, and the work is now wholly decayed through length of time, there is nothing that can with certainty be related concerning it. Yet it is apparent it was of an exceeding great height, and that by the advantage of it the Chaldaean astrologers exactly observed the setting and rising of the stars. The whole was built of brick, cemented with brimstone with great art and cost. Upon the top she placed 3 statues of beaten gold, of Jupiter, Juno, and Rhea. That of Jupiter stood upright in the posture, as if he were walking. He was 40 feet in height, and weighed 1,000 Babylonish talents. Footnote: the heavy Babylonian talent weighed about 75 pounds, the light talent about 52. End of footnote. The statue of Rhea was of the same weight, sitting on a golden throne, having 2 lions standing on either side, one at her knees, and near to them 2 exceeding great serpents of silver, weighing 30 talents each. Here likewise the image of Juno stood upright, and weighed 800 talents, grasping a serpent by the head in her right hand, and holding a sceptre adorned with precious stones in her left. For all these deities there was placed a common table made of beaten gold, 40 feet long and 15 broad, weighing 500 talents, upon which stood 2 cups, weighing 30 talents, and near to them as many censers, weighing 300 talents. There were there likewise placed 3 drinking bowls of gold, one of which, dedicated to Jupiter, weighed 1,200 Babylonish talents, but the other 2 600 each. But all those the Persian kings sacrilegiously carried away, and length of time has either altogether consumed or much defaced the palaces and the other structures, so that at this day but a small part of this Babylon is inhabited, and the greatest part, which lay within the walls, is turned into tillage and pasture. End of section 93. This recording is in the public domain.
Eva March Tappan. Section 94. The Make-Believe Elephants of Semiramis. By Diodorus the Sicilian. Semiramis, having settled her affairs in Egypt and Ethiopia, returned with her army into Asia to Bactria, and now, having a great army and enjoying a long peace, she had a longing desire to perform some notable exploit by her arms. Hearing, therefore, that the Indians were the greatest nation in the whole world, and had the largest and richest tract of land of all, she resolved to make war upon them. Stabrobates was at that time king, who had innumerable forces and many elephants bravely accoutred and fitted to strike terror into the hearts of his enemies. For India, because of the pleasantness of the country, excelled all others, being watered in every place with many rivers, so that the land yielded every year a double crop, and by that means was so rich and so abounded with plenty of all things necessary for the sustenance of man's life, that it supplied the inhabitants continually with such things as made them excessively rich, insomuch as it was never known that there was ever any famine amongst them, the climate being so happy and favorable. And upon that account likewise there is an incredible number of elephants, which for courage and strength of body far excel those in Africa. Moreover, this country abounds in gold, silver, brass, iron, and precious stones of all sorts, both for profit and pleasure. All which being noised abroad, so stirred up the spirit of Semiramis, that, though she had no provocation given her, yet she was resolved upon the war against the Indians. But knowing that she had need of great forces, she sent dispatches to all the provinces with command to the governors to list the choicest young men they could find, ordering the proportion of soldiers every province and country should send forth, according to the largeness of it, and commanded that all should furnish themselves with new arms and armor, and all appear in 3 years' time at a general rendezvous in Bactria, bravely armed and accoutred in all points. And having sent for shipwrights out of Phoenicia, Syria, Cyprus, and other places bordering upon the sea-coast, she prepared timber for them fit for the purpose, and ordered them to build vessels that might be taken asunder and conveyed from place to place wherever she pleased. For the river Indus bordering upon that kingdom, being the greatest in those parts, she stood in need of many river boats to pass it, in order to repress the Indians. But there being no timber near the river, she was compelled to convey the boats thither by land from Bactria. She further considered that she was much inferior to the Indians in elephants, which is absolutely necessary for her to make use of. She therefore contrived to have beasts that should resemble them, hoping by this means to strike a terror into the Indians, who believed there were no elephants in any place but in India. To this end she provided 300,000 black oxen, and distributed the flesh among a company of ordinary mechanics and such fellows as she had to play the cobblers for her, and ordered them, by stitching the skins together and stuffing them with straw, to imitate the shape of an elephant, and in every one of them she put a man to govern them and a camel to carry them, so that at a distance they appeared to all that saw them as if they were really such beasts. They that were employed in this work wrought at it night and day in a place which was walled round for the purpose, and guards set at every gate, that none might be admitted either to go in or out, to the end that none might see what they were doing, lest it should be noised abroad, and come to the ear of the Indians. Having therefore provided shipping and elephants in the space of 2 years, in the third she rendezvoused all her forces in Bactria. Her army consisted of 3,000,000 of foot, 200,000 horse, 100,000 chariots, and mounted upon camels 100,000 men with swords 4 cubits long. The boats that might be taken asunder were 2,000, which the camels carried by land as they did the mock elephants, as we have before declared. The soldiers made their horses familiar with these feigned beasts, bringing them often to them, lest they should be terrified at the sight of them, which Perseus imitated many ages after when he was to fight with the Romans, who had elephants in their army out of Africa. However, this contrivance proved to be of no advantage either to him or her, as will appear in the issue herein a little after related. When Stabrotus, the Indian king, heard of these great armies and the mighty preparations made against him, he did all he could to excel Semiramis in everything. At first he built of great canes 4,000 river boats, for abundance of these canes grow in India about the rivers and fens, so thick as a man can scarce fathom, and vessels made of these reeds, they say, are exceedingly useful, because they will never rot or be worm-eaten. He was very diligent likewise in preparing of arms and going from place to place throughout all India, and so raised a far greater army than that of Semiramis. To his former number of elephants he added more, which he took by hunting, and furnished them all with everything that might make them look terrible in the face of their enemies, so that by their multitude and the completeness of their armor in all points, it seemed above the strength and power of man to bear up against the violent shock of these creatures. Having therefore made all these preparations, he sent ambassadors to Semiramis, as she was on her march towards him, to complain and upbraid her for beginning a war without any provocation or injury offered her, and by his private letters taxed her with the course of his life, and vowed, calling the gods to witness, that if he conquered her he would nail her to the cross. When she read the letter she smiled, and said the Indian should presently have a trial of her valor by her actions. When she came up with her army to the river Indus, she found the enemy's fleet drawn up in a line of battle, whereupon she forthwith drew up her own, and having manned it with the stoutest soldiers, joined battle, yet so ordering the matter as to have her land forces ready upon the shore, to be assisting as there should be occasion. After a long and sharp fight, with marks of valor on both sides, Semiramis was at length victorious, and sank 1,000 of the enemy's vessels, and took a great number of prisoners. Puffed up with this success, she took in the cities and islands that lay in the river, and carried away 100,000 captives. After this the Indian king drew off his army, as if he fled for fear, but in truth to decoy his enemies to pass the river. Semiramis, therefore, seeing things fall out according to her wish, laid a broad bridge of boats, and at a vast charge, over the river, and thereby passed over all her forces, leaving only 70,000 to guard the bridge, and with the rest of her army pursued the Indians. She placed the mock elephants in the front, that the enemy's scouts might presently inform the king what multitudes of elephants she had in her army, and she was not deceived in her hopes, for when the spies gave an account to the Indians what a great multitude of these creatures were advancing towards them, they were all in amaze, inquiring among themselves whence the Assyrians should be supplied with such a vast number of elephants. But the cheat could not long be concealed, for some of Semiramis' soldiers being laid by the hills for their carelessness upon the guard, through fear of further punishment, made their escape and fled to the enemy, and undeceived them as to the elephants. Upon which the Indian king was mightily encouraged, and caused notice of the delusion to be spread through the whole army, and forthwith marched with all his force against the Assyrians, Semiramis, on the other hand, doing the like. When they approached near one another, Stabrodes, the Indian king, placed his horse and chariots in the vanguard at a good distance before the main body of his army, the queen having placed her mock elephants at the like distance from her main body, valiantly received her enemies' charge. But the Indian horses were most strangely terrified, for in appearance the phantasms at a distance seemed to be real elephants, and the horses of the Indians, being inured to these creatures, pressed boldly and undauntedly forward. But when they came near and saw another kind of beast than usual, and the smell and almost everything else being strange and new to them, they broke in with great terror and confusion, one upon another, so that they cast some of their riders headlong to the ground, ran away with others, as the lot happened, into the midst of their enemies. Whereupon Semiramis, readily making use of her advantage, with a body of choice men fell in upon them and routed them, forcing them back to their main body. Though Stabrodes was something astonished at this unexpected defeat, yet he brought up his foot against the enemy with his elephants in the front. He himself was in the right wing, mounted upon a stately elephant, and made a fierce charge upon the queen herself, who happened then to be opposite him in the left. And though the mock elephants in Semiramis' army did the like, yet they stood the violent shock of the other but a little while. For the Indian beasts, being both exceeding strong and stout, easily bore down and destroyed all that opposed them, so that there was a great slaughter. For some they trampled under foot, others they rent in pieces with their teeth, tossing up others with their trunks into the air. The ground, therefore, being covered with heaps of dead carcasses, and nothing but death and destruction to be seen on every hand, so that all were full of horror and amazement, none durst keep their order or ranks any longer. Upon which the whole Assyrian army fled outright, and the Indian king encountered Semiramis, and first wounded her with an arrow in the arm, and afterwards with a dart, in wheeling about, in the shoulder. Whereupon the queen, her wounds not being mortal, fled, and by the swiftness of her horse, which far exceeded the other that pursued her, she got off, but all making one way to the bridge of boats, and such a vast multitude of men thronging together in one straight and narrow passage. The queen's soldiers miserably perished by treading down one another under foot, and, which was strange and unusual, horse and foot lay tumbling promiscuously one over another. When they at length came to the bridge, and the Indians at their heels, the consternation was so great that many on both sides the bridge were tumbled over into the river. But when the greatest part of those that remained had got over, Semiramis caused the cords and tenons of the bridge to be cut, which done, the boats, which were before joined together and upon which a great number of Indians nodded in the pursuit, being now divided into many parts, and carried here and there by the force of the current, multitudes of the Indians were drowned, and Semiramis was now safe and secure, having such a barrier as the river betwixt her and her enemies. Whereupon the Indian king, being forewarned by prodigies from heaven, and the opinions of the soothsayers, forbore all further pursuit, and Semiramis, making exchange of prisoners in Bactria, returned with scarce a third part of her army. End of chapter 94.
Daniel the Fearless, from the Old Testament, 6th century BC. Daniel in the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Footnote: the cubit of the Hebrews was about 17½ inches. End of footnote. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors and captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then an herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshippeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Wherefore at that time certain Chaldaeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshippeth, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image that thou hast set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if ye be ready that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made, well. But if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 17 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste and spake, and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake, and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth, and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Daniel in the den of lions. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault. Forasmuch as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king, and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains, have consulted together to establish a royal statute, and to make a firm decree, that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree, and sign the writing, that it be not changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day, and prayed, and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled, and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Then they came near, and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, That Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men assembled unto the king, and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is, that no decree nor statute which the king establisheth may be changed. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and the signet of his lords, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace, and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning, and went in haste unto the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live for ever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. Forasmuch as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. Then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, Peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree, that in every domain of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast for ever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. End of section 95. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ellen Murphy.
Belshazzar there in kingly hall is holding kingly festival. The vessels set in glittering line, and emptied the goblets with glowing wine. The goblets rattle, the choruses swell, and it pleased the stiff-necked monarch well. In the monarch's cheeks a wild fire glowed, and the wine awoke his daring mood. And onward still by his madness spurred, he blasphemes the Lord with a sinful word. And he brazenly boasts, blaspheming wild, while the servile courtiers cheered and smiled. Quick the king spoke, while his proud glance burned, quickly the servant went and returned. He bore on his head the vessels of gold, of Jehovah's temple the plunder bold. With daring hand, in his frenzy grim, the king seized a beaker, and filled to the brim, and drained to the dregs the sacred cup, and foaming he cried, as he drank it up, Jehovah, eternal scorn I own to thee, I am monarch of Babylon. Scarce had the terrible blasphemy rolled from his lips, ere the monarch at heart was cold. The yelling laughter was hushed, and all was still as death in the royal hall. And see on the white wall high, the form of a hand went slowly by, and wrote on the broad wall white letters of fire, and vanished in night. Pale as death, with a steady stare, and with trembling knees, the king sat there. The horde of slaves sat shuddering chill, no word they spoke, but were deathlike still. The magians came, but of them all none could read the flame script on the wall. But that same night, in all his pride, by the hands of his servants, Belshazzar died. End of section 96. This recording is in the public domain.
Tappan. Section 97. The Fall of Babylon by Jacob Abbott, 558 B.C. The kingdom of the Medes and Persians, lying to the east of Mesopotamia, had been increasing in power so rapidly that the rulers of Lydia and of Babylonia became alarmed and formed a league against it. Cyrus, the Persian king, first overpowered Lydia and then attacked the Babylonian king. In 538 B.C., Babylon fell into the hands of the Persians. The Editor. In his advance toward the dominions of Croesus in Asia Minor, Cyrus had passed to the northward of the great and celebrated city of Babylon. Babylon was on the Euphrates, toward the southern part of Asia. It was the capital of a large and very fertile region, which extended on both sides of the Euphrates toward the Persian Gulf. The limits of the country, however, which was subject to Babylon, varied very much at different times, as they were extended or contracted by revolutions and wars. The river Euphrates was the great source of fertility for the whole region through which it flowed. The country bordered by this river was very densely populated, and the inhabitants were industrious and peaceable, cultivating their land and living quietly and happily on its fruits. The surface was intersected with canals, which the people had made for conveying the water of the river over the land for the purpose of irrigating it. Some of these canals were navigable. There was one great trunk which passed from the Euphrates to the Tigris, supplying many minor canals by the way that was navigable for vessels of considerable burden. The traffic of the country was, however, mainly conducted by means of boats of moderate size, the construction of which seemed to Herodotus very curious and remarkable. The city was enormously large and required immense supplies of food, which were brought down in these boats from the agricultural country above. The boats were made in the following manner. First, a frame was built, of the shape of the intended boat, broad and shallow, and with the stem and stern of the same form. This frame was made of willows, like a basket, and when finished was covered with a sheathing of skins. A layer of reeds was then spread over the bottom of the boat to protect the frame and to distribute evenly the pressure of the cargo. The boat thus finished was laden with the produce of the country and was then floated down the river to Babylon. In this navigation, the boatmen were careful to protect the leather sheathing from injury by avoiding all contact with rocks or even with the gravel of the shores. They kept their craft in the middle of the stream by means of 2 oars, or rather an oar and a paddle, which were worked, the first at the bows and the second at the stern. The advance of the boat was in some measure accelerated by these boatmen. Though their main function was to steer their vessel by keeping it out of eddies and away from projecting points of land, and directing its course to those parts of the stream where the current was swiftest, and where it consequently be borne forward most rapidly to its destination. These boats were generally of very considerable size, and they carried, in addition to their cargo and crew, 1 or more beasts of burden, generally asses or mules. These animals were allowed the pleasure, if any pleasure it was to them, of sailing thus idly down the stream, for the sake of having them at hand at the end of the voyage to carry back again up the country the skins, which constituted the most valuable portion of the craft they sailed in. It was found that these skins, if carefully preserved, would be easily transported up the river and would answer the purpose of a second voyage. Accordingly, when the boats arrived at Babylon, the cargo was sold. The boats were broken up, the skins were folded into packs, and in this form the mules carried them up the river again, the boatmen driving the mules as they walked by their side. Babylon was a city of immense extent and magnitude. In fact, the accounts given of the space which it covered have often been considered incredible. These accounts make the space which was included within the walls 4 or 5 times as large as London. A great deal of this space, however, was occupied by parks and gardens connected with the royal palaces, and by open squares. Then, besides, the houses occupied by the common people in the ancient cities were of fewer stories in height, and consequently more extended on the ground, than those built in modern times. In fact, it is probable that in many instances they were mere ranges of huts and hovels, as in the case indeed to a considerable extent in Oriental cities at the present day, so that it is not at all impossible that even so large an area as 4 or 5 times the size of London may have been included within the fortifications of the city. In respect to the walls of the city, very extraordinary and apparently contradictory accounts are given by the various ancient authors who describe them. Some make them 75, and others 200 or 300 feet high. There have been many discussions in respect to the comparative credibility of these several statements, and some ingenious attempts have been made to reconcile them. It is not, however, at all surprising that there should be such a diversity in the dimensions given, for the walling of an ancient city was seldom of the same height in all places. The structure necessarily varied according to the nature of the ground, being high wherever the ground without was such as to give the enemy an advantage in an attack, and lower in other situations, where the conformation of the surface was such as to afford of itself a partial protection. It is not, perhaps, impossible that at some particular points, as for example across glens and ravines, or along steep declivities, the walls of Babylon may have been raised, even to the very extraordinary height which Herodotus ascribes to them. The walls were made of bricks, and the bricks were formed of clay and earth, which was dug from a trench made outside of the lines. This trench served the purpose of a ditch, to strengthen the fortification when the wall was completed. The water from the river and from streams flowing toward the river was admitted to these ditches on every side and kept them always full. The sides of these ditches were lined with bricks too, which were made, like those of the walls, from the earth obtained from the excavations. They used for all this masonry a cement made from a species of bitumen, which was found in great quantities floating down one of the rivers, which flowed into the Euphrates in the neighborhood of Babylon. The river Euphrates itself flowed through the city. There was a breastwork or low wall along the banks of it on either side, with openings at the terminations of the streets leading to the water and flights of steps to go down. These openings were secured by gates of brass, which, when closed, would prevent an enemy from gaining access to the city from the river. The great streets which terminated thus at the river on one side extended to the walls of the city on the other, and they were crossed by other streets at right angles to them. In the outer walls of the city, At the extremities of all these streets were massive gates of brass, with hinges and frames of the same metal. There were 100 of these gates in all. They were guarded by watchtowers on the walls above. The watchtowers were built on both the inner and outer faces of the wall, and the wall itself was so broad that there was room between these watchtowers for a chariot and 4 to drive and turn. The river, of course, divided the city into 2 parts. The king's palace was in the center of one of these divisions, within a vast circular enclosure, which contained the palace buildings, together with spacious courts and parks and gardens pertaining to them. In the center of the other division was a corresponding enclosure, which contained the great temple of Belus. Here there was a very lofty tower, divided into 8 separate towers, one above the other, with a winding staircase to ascend to the summit. In the upper story was a sort of chapel, with a couch and a table and other furniture for use in the sacred ceremonies, all of gold. Above this, on the highest platform of all, was a grand observatory, where the Babylonian astrologers made their celestial observations. There was a bridge across the river, connecting one section of the city with the other, and it is said that there was a subterranean passage under the river also, which was used as a private communication between 2 public edifices, palaces or citadels, which were situated near the extremities of the bridge. All these constructions were of the most grand and imposing character. In addition to the architectural magnificence of these buildings, the gates and walls were embellished with a great variety of sculptures, images of animals of every form and in every attitude, and men, single and in groups, models of great sovereigns, and representations of hunting scenes, battle scenes, and great events in the Babylonian history. The most remarkable, however, of all the wonders of Babylon, though perhaps not built till after Cyrus's time, were what were called the Hanging Gardens. Although called the Hanging Gardens, they were not suspended in any manner, as the name might denote, but were supported upon arches and walls. The arches and walls sustained a succession of terraces rising one above another, with broad flights of steps for ascending to them, and on these terraces the gardens were made. The upper terrace, or platform, was several hundred feet from the ground, so high that it was necessary to build arches upon arches within, in order to attain the requisite elevation. The lateral thrust of these arches was sustained by a wall 25 feet in thickness, which surrounded the garden on all sides, and rose as high as the lowermost tier of arches, upon which would, of course, be concentrated the pressure and weight of all the pile. The whole structure thus formed a sort of artificial hill, square in form, and rising in a succession of terraces to a broad and level area upon the top. The extent of this grand square upon the summit was 400 feet upon each side. The surface which served as the foundation for the gardens that adorned these successive terraces, and the area above, was formed in the following manner. Over the masonry of the arches there was laid a pavement of broad, flat stones, 16 feet long and 4 feet wide. Over these there was placed a stratum of reeds laid in bitumen, and above them another flooring of bricks cemented closely together, so as to be impervious to water. To make the security complete in this respect, the upper surface of this brick flooring was covered with sheets of lead, overlapping each other in such a manner as to convey all the water which might percolate through the mold away to the sides of the garden. The earth and mold were placed upon this surface thus prepared, and the stratum was so deep as to allow large trees to take root and grow in it. There was an engine constructed in the middle of the upper terrace, by which water could be drawn up from the river and distributed over every part of the vast pile. The gardens thus completed were filled to profusion with every species of tree and plant and vine which could produce fruit or flowers to enrich or adorn such a scene. Every country in communication with Babylon was made to contribute something to increase the endless variety of floral beauty which was here literally enthroned. Gardeners of great experience and skill were constantly employed in cultivating the parterres, pruning the fruit trees and the vines, preserving the walks, and introducing new varieties of vegetation. In a word, the hanging gardens of Babylon became one of the wonders of the world. The country in the neighborhood of Babylon, extending from the river on either hand, was in general level and low, and subject to inundations. One of the sovereigns of the country, a queen named Nitocris, had formed the grand design of constructing an immense lake to take off the superfluous water in case of a flood, and thus preventing an overflow. She also opened a great number of lateral and winding channels for the river, wherever the natural disposition of the surface afforded facilities for doing so, and the earth which was taken out in the course of these excavations was employed in raising the banks by artificial terraces, such as are made to confine the Mississippi at New Orleans, and are there called levees. Footnote: from the French word levee, raised. End footnote. The object of Nitocris in these measures was twofold. She wished, in the first place, to open all practicable channels for the flow of the water, and then to confine the current within the channels thus made. She also wished to make the navigation of the stream as intricate and complicated as possible, so that while the natives of the country might easily find their way in boats to the capital, a foreign enemy, if he should make the attempt, might be confused and lost. These were the rivers of Babylon, on the banks of which the captive Jews sat down and wept when they remembered Zion. The Queen Nitocris seems to have been quite distinguished for her engineering and architectural plans. It was she that built the bridge across the Euphrates within the city, and as there was a feeling of jealousy and ill will, as usual in such a case, between the two divisions of the town which the river formed, she caused the bridge to be constructed with a movable platform or draw, by means of which the communication might be cut off at pleasure. This draw was generally up at night and down by day. Herodotus relates a curious anecdote of this queen, which, if true, evinces in another way the peculiar originality of mind and the ingenuity which characterized all her operations. She caused her tomb to be built before her death over one of the principal gates of the city. Upon the facade of this monument was a very conspicuous inscription to this effect: "If any one of the sovereigns, my successors, shall be in extreme want of money, let him open my tomb and take what he may think proper, but let him not resort to this resource unless the urgency is extreme. The tomb remained for some time after the queen's death quite undisturbed. In fact, the people of the city avoided this gate altogether, on account of the dead body deposited above it, and the spot became well nigh deserted. At length, in process of time, a subsequent sovereign, being in want of money, ventured to open the tomb. He found, however, no money within. The gloomy vault contained nothing but the dead body of the queen, and a label with this inscription: "If your avarice were not as insatiable as it is base, you would not have intruded on the repose of the dead." It was not surprising that Cyrus, having been so successful in his enterprises thus far, should now begin to turn his thoughts toward this great Babylonian empire, and to feel a desire to bring it under his sway. The first thing, however, was to confirm and secure his Lydian conquests. He spent some time, therefore, in organizing and arranging at Sardis the affairs of the new government, which he was to substitute for that of Croesus there. He designated certain portions of his army to be left for garrisons in the conquered cities. He appointed Persian officers, of course, to command these forces, but as he wished to conciliate the Lydians, he appointed many of the municipal and civil officers of the country from among them. There would appear to be no danger in doing this, as by giving the command of the army to Persians, he retained all the real power directly in his own hands. One of these civil officers, the most important, in fact, of all, was the Grand Treasurer. To him Cyrus committed the charge of the stores of gold and silver which came into his possession at Sardis, and of the revenues which were afterward to accrue. Cyrus appointed a Lydian named Pactyas to this trust, hoping by such measures to conciliate the people of the country and to make them more ready to submit to his sway. Things being thus arranged, Cyrus, taking Croesus with him, set out with the main army to return toward the east. As soon as he had left Lydia, Pactyas excited the Lydians to revolt. The name of the commander-in-chief of the military forces which Cyrus had left was Tabillus. Pactyas abandoned the city and retired toward the coast, where he contrived to raise a large army, formed partly of Lydians and partly of bodies of foreign troops, which he was enabled to hire by means of the treasures which Cyrus had put under his charge. He then advanced to Sardis, took possession of the town, and shut up Tabillus with his Persian troops in the citadel. When the tidings of these events came to Cyrus, he was very much incensed, and determined to destroy the city. Croesus, however, interceded very earnestly in its behalf. He recommended that Cyrus, instead of burning Sardis, should send a sufficient force to disarm the population, and that he should then enact such laws and make such arrangements as should turn the minds of the people to habits of luxury and pleasure. By doing this, said Croesus, the people will in a short time become so enervated and so effeminate that you will have nothing to fear from them. Cyrus decided on adopting this plan. He dispatched a Median named Mezares, an officer of his army at the head of a strong force, with orders to go back to Sardis to deliver Tabillus from his danger, to seize and put to death all the leaders in the Lydian rebellion, excepting Pactyas. Pactyas was to be saved alive and sent a prisoner to Cyrus in Persia. Pactyas did not wait for the arrival of Mezares. As soon as he heard of his approach, he abandoned the ground and fled northwardly to the city of Syme and sought refuge there. When Mezares had reached Sardis and re-established the government of Cyrus there, he sent messages to Syme demanding the surrender of the fugitive. The people of Syme were uncertain whether they ought to comply. They said that they must first consult an oracle. There was a very ancient and celebrated oracle near Miletus, and they sent messengers to this oracle, demanding to know whether it were according to the will of the gods or not that the fugitive should be surrendered. The answer brought back was that they might surrender him. They were accordingly making arrangements for doing this when one of the citizens, a very prominent and influential man named Aristodicus, expressed himself not satisfied with the reply. He did not think it possible, he said, that the oracle could really counsel them to deliver up a helpless fugitive to his enemies. The messengers must have misunderstood or misreported the answer which they had received. He finally persuaded his countrymen to send a second embassy. He himself was placed at the head of it. On their arrival, Aristodicus addressed the oracle as follows: "To avoid a cruel death from the Persians, Pactyas, a Lydian, fled to us for refuge. The Persians demanded that we should surrender him. Much as we are afraid of their power, we are still more afraid to deliver up a helpless suppliant for protection, without clear and decided directions from you." The embassy received to this demand the same reply as before. Still, Aristodicus was not satisfied, and as if by way of bringing home to the oracle somewhat more forcibly a sense of the true character of such an action as it seemed to recommend, he began to make a circuit in the grove which was around the temple in which the oracle resided, and to rob and destroy the nests which the birds had built there, allured apparently by the sacred repose and quietude of the scene. This had the desired effect. A solemn voice was heard from the interior of the temple, saying in a warning tone, "Impious man, how dost thou dare to molest those who have placed themselves under my protection?" To this Aristodicus replied by asking the oracle how it was that it watched over and guarded those who sought its own protection, while it directed the people of Syme to abandon and betray suppliants for theirs. To this the oracle answered, "I direct them to do it, in order that such impious men may the sooner bring down upon their heads the judgments of heaven for having dared to entertain even the thought of delivering up a helpless fugitive." When this answer was reported to the people of Syme, they did not dare to give Pactyas up, nor on the other hand did they dare to incur the enmity of the Persians by retaining and protecting him. They accordingly sent him secretly away. The emissaries of Mezares, however, followed him. They kept constantly on his track, demanding him successively of every city where the hapless fugitive sought refuge, until at length, partly by threats and partly by a reward, they induced a certain city to surrender him. Mezares sent him a prisoner to Cyrus. Soon after this, Mezares himself died, and Harpagus was appointed governor of Lydia in his stead. In the meantime, Cyrus went on with his conquests in the heart of Asia, and at length, in the course of a few years, he had completed his arrangements and preparations for the attack on Babylon. He advanced at the head of a large force to the vicinity of the city. The king of Babylon, whose name was Belshazzar, withdrew within the walls, shut the gates, and felt perfectly secure. A simple wall was in those days a very effectual protection against any armed force whatever, if it was only high enough not to be scaled, and thick enough to resist the blows of a battering ram. The artillery of modern times would have speedily made a fatal breach in such structures, but there was nothing but the simple force of man, applied through brazen-headed beams of wood in those days, and Belshazzar knew well that his walls would bid all such modes of demolition a complete defiance. He stationed his soldiers, therefore, on the walls, and his sentinels in the watchtowers, while he himself and all the nobles of his court, feeling perfectly secure in their impregnable condition, and being abundantly supplied with all the means that the whole empire could furnish, both for sustenance and enjoyment, gave themselves up in their spacious palaces and gardens to gaiety, festivity, and pleasure. Cyrus advanced to the city. He stationed one large detachment of his troops at the opening in the main walls, where the river entered into the city, and another one below, where it issued from it. These detachments were ordered to march into the city by the bed of the river as soon as they should observe the water subsiding. He then employed a vast force of laborers to open new channels, and to widen and deepen those which had existed before, for the purpose of drawing off the waters from their usual bed. When these passages were thus prepared, the water was let into them one night, at a time previously designated, and it soon ceased to flow through the city. The detachments of soldiers marched in over the bed of the stream, carrying with them vast numbers of ladders. With these they easily scaled the low walls which lined the banks of the river, and Belshazzar was thunderstruck. With the announcement made to him in the midst of one of his feasts that the Persians were in complete and full possession of the city. End of section 97. This recording is in the public domain.